The Unrelating podcasts are meant to be for education and entertainment. They don't constitute a service or advice. For personal struggles, please reach out to a medical or mental health professional.
Hey, Michelle.
Hey, how's it going, Kel?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Today, we're going to pull back the curtains on the legal system. We have a special guest, retired Michigan judge, who is going to be bringing his perspective on the legal system. Just to throw some stats at you, intimate partner violence alone affects more than 12 million people every year. An average of 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by a partner in the United States. That's more than 12 million women and men over the course of the year. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men aged 18 and older in the U.S. have been the victim of physical violence by a partner in their lifetime.
Yeah, to go even a step further, globally, tens of thousands of women are killed. About 140 women and girls die every day at the hands of their partner or close relative, which, if you do the math, means that 1 woman or girl is killed every 10 minutes in the world due to violence against them by a family member or an intimate partner.
Yeah, it's really just shocking when you hear these numbers.
Yeah, and to be coming from the specific and unique perspective of a judge who was dealing with this sort of thing every day, restraining orders and allegations and just trying to keep people safe and understand what's going on. That's really not something you get to hear about a lot from the legal system perspective.
Selfishly, I've always been a fan of television and film that that has a legal perspective or legal angle. And so you see all these shows that have a judge. It's always interesting to see the behind the scenes of that, or learn about the behind the scenes of that.
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with watching therapists on TV shows. I like some, I think others, make my skin crawl. So it's funny because I do like the law shows too. I'm curious if he'll let us know whether any of that is remotely accurate.
Welcome to Unrelating with Kel Michelle, and I'm one of your hosts, Kelly. With me is my co-host, Michelle, a licensed marriage and family therapist who's been providing individual and couples therapy for over 2 decades. Together, we'll explore how we engage in relationships, why we do what we do, and what causes people to unrelate.
Joining us today on Unrelating with Kel Michelle is Bill Buhl. Bill was a prosecutor for 6 years and then represented people in divorce cases. He later spent 14 years as a district court judge, handling the divorce cases the first 8 years in circuit court. Does that sound right?
That's correct, yeah.
Welcome, Bill. Really appreciate you joining us.
Glad to be here.
Let's just start by meeting you. And what drove you, Bill, to enter the legal profession?
My high school English teacher. I went through undergraduate school as a history major and realized I didn't have a goal beyond that. And I thought about teaching, but my high school English teacher had said to me my senior year, you ought to think about going into the law. And she's a pretty wise lady. So I thought, well, I'm going to try it. After my first year of law school, if I hate it, I'll do something else. But I didn't hate it. So that's what got me there.
And it sounds like once you graduated and started practicing, it just took off immediately.
Right place, right time. Michigan was in a transition period. And, I never appreciated how tumultuous the 60s were until I look back. But we had a constitutional convention and abolished the justice of the peace. And with that, they created the district court, because before that, the lowest trial level was a justice of the peace. And there was an automatic appeal from that. But they created the district court, and the fellow that hired me to clerk for him till I passed the bar, and who I was in partnership with my first year, ran for district judge. And I was also an assistant prosecutor that year because nobody wanted the job. It only paid $4,000. Wow. Supposed to be part-time. And so they said, well, why don't you run for prosecutor? So, 11 months past getting my license, I was a prosecuting attorney of Van Buren County. And I was too naive to understand how grave a responsibility that was, so it didn't bother me, And that's how I got started so fast, is it just all happened at a time when there weren't a wealth of lawyers in the county, and really nobody wanted those jobs.
True, but to succeed, I mean, you say right place, right time. I say right place, right time, right person.
Yeah,
You
I
were,
liked every job I've ever had to some degree. It was always a challenge, and I always tried to do it well. And I like to think that was a major contributing factor, and it might have been major, but part of it was like nobody can run against you for those jobs unless they're lawyers, and there weren't any lawyers around that wanted the job. So, but I embraced it. I enjoyed being a prosecutor. I did not have any desire to be a judge.
hmm.
My wife is responsible for that. And my wife is a very private person, and she hated being Mrs. Prosecutor, and she hates even more being Mrs. Judge. So she said, when the judge resigned, why don't you put your name in? And I thought, what is this about? And she said, well, you've complained about this judge for 5 years, so go do it. Right. And she said, I think you have the right personality for it. She's very observant. She was correct. It was a perfect fit for me. And so I went from there to 14 years. I was a happy district judge. And then they created a new circuit judgeship. And the county commission wasn't sure they wanted to agree to it. So they wanted to know who was going to run for it. So they came to me and said, run for it. And I said, I don't want to run for it. I'm happy. And they said, well, if you don't, we're not going to approve it. So they just wanted to be sure who they were getting. And so I thought about it. And I was afraid maybe I'd pick up an opponent because now that job was more prestigious in people's eyes. I didn't view it that way, but, so that's how I ended up running for circuit court. Mm. It just all fell into place. And there I was.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say that you weren't ambitious, but I think excelling the way you did, it was helpful that you weren't trying to gain power or trying to be prestigious. You were just trying to do a good job and it came to you.
I think that helped because sometimes people want those jobs for the wrong reasons.
Exactly.
And you can coast along. I mean, you can make the job as challenging as you want, and you can delegate the heck out of everything and give it to your law clerk and not think about it. Or you can actually use some discernment and make the decision you're supposed to make. I just kind of wanted to write my own opinions if I had to write an opinion. It was just kind of how everything fell into place.
So over your years of practice and then as a judge, what were some of the themes or common themes you saw in divorce cases?
Emotion drove most of them. Not very many of the divorce cases were pleasant and easy to deal with, and people were still friends. There was a lot of contention over child custody. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of manipulation. Sometimes the only sensible people in the divorce case were the kids. The only thing I liked about divorce with children is doing the in-camera visit with the child. And I found that one of the things you had to do in a divorce case is not advantage one party over the other when it started. And a lot of divorce cases start with the plaintiff coming in, they want an ex parte order where the other party hasn't had a say. And they tell you some horror story about, oh my gosh, the kids are in danger and so forth. And I learned real quickly not to sign those ex parte orders because the rest of the story was always quite interesting and not anything like the first party told you. So what I would do to address it, just in case there really was a danger, is I would say, no, I'll give you an emergency hearing in 3 days. You show up, they show up, bring the kids. And they'd come in. And nobody had the judge ordering that you go out and snatch your kids from one parent or the other. And if you start one that way, it goes south the rest of the case. You're going to have a nightmare. And so that was one common theme I saw is don't start a divorce case with those ex parte orders. The other thing they like to do was to kick the other person out of the house. I want exclusive use of the premises, and I never granted those. I give them a quick hearing if they had to have one, but that was a common theme. Some of the most irrational behavior I ever saw were in divorce cases.
You mentioned kids, but were these divorce cases younger couples typically? What they say, they call it the 7-year itch when people typically get divorced. But around what ages were you seeing a lot of divorce cases?
They ran the gauntlet.
Okay.
Some people, when they've been married 20, 30 years, they get divorced. My shortest case is I'm a district judge, and district judges can do weddings, could and still can. Circuit judges can't. We don't have the authority as a circuit judge to do weddings. Maybe it's because we have the right to divorce people. I don't know. But a lawyer friend of mine came in and said, I'm getting remarried. He was divorced. I'm getting remarried. Would you do our wedding? And in November, before I took the circuit bench, I did his wedding. In February, I did his divorce.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God. What are the reasons?
Things didn't work out. Apparently, They really didn't know each other. But I had them all over the place. And some really ridiculous things, like some guy goes on a ski vacation with his wife and her family because his family liked to ski, and it took a side trip and met some woman he hooked up with on the ski trip. Now, that one ended up a big battle. I mean, I think between the two of them, they spent $50,000 on attorney's fees trying to beat each other up.
Oh, my God.
So you get just all sorts of things.
I would imagine adultery would be a theme with divorce, as well as money issues. Did you see a fair share of both of those?
Money isn't usually the motivating factor, although it is in some cases. There's a lot of situations where there's another person involved. I don't know if you're familiar with a no-fault divorce versus the old way. I mean, in the old way, somebody had to be the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then right when I came in to practice in 1968, shortly thereafter, Michigan went to no-fault divorce, which I was thankful for. One of my first divorce cases in 1968, I lost uncontested. How can you lose an uncontested divorce?
Yeah.
And what happened is it was fault. And I had this gentle fellow who was older, and he married this woman who just wanted to get her hooks into his money. And immediately after they were married, he had to get rid of the dog, which he loved, and she knew it. And she wanted to be joint on all his bank accounts. And then he suddenly realized all she wanted was his money. He filed for divorce finally, and he came in to give proofs, and the judge was very particular. And then you had to show that someone that you're divorcing did something bad, that they were the bad guy. And my guy was such a gentleman that he would not say a bad thing about her. Now, he told me all the things in my office, but I couldn't get him to say one thing. And the judge said, there's no basis here. The only one would be abandonment, and that has to be so many years. So I lost my case. we ended up having her file in Jackson County, and she didn't mind bad-mouthing him.
Right.
So
it's funny though, because I was just reading there's a bit of a political movement right now against a no-fault divorce.
You're
There's
right.
some folks saying that no-fault divorce is, favors one gender over the other for various reasons. We don't have to get into it, but it's interesting to hear your take on no-fault.
That movement is the idea that somehow you got to make it difficult. So people shouldn't be getting divorced. They're just not trying. You're right. I've seen that too. And I think it would really take us backwards in a lot of ways. I don't see it would make anything better. It's sort of like making felons out of teenage sex. We'll call it a felony, then they won't do it.
Yeah, and you're talking about some very heightened feelings people have making divorces nasty, and domestic violence. All of that plays into the idea of divorce. If people are pushing for people not to get divorced who really should not be together,
right?
You know,
we had some interesting projects in Michigan, along with the domestic assault restraining order and the personal protection order. Washtenaw County tried an experiment where they thought they could resolve some of the things with domestic violence in the cycle. So they put a program in place, and it had counseling connected to it. And they would only allow the criminal complaint if the police officer signed it. Now, this was after they allowed police to arrest without a warrant for the misdemeanors not committed in their presence. And then when they went before the judge, if there was any indication of retribution on the part of the defendant, they would make a bond condition that he couldn't go back in the house. And they mandated counseling, and they made available safe houses and that kind of thing. So if a woman came in and said, I want to drop it, they would say, I'm sorry, you're not the complainant. We're going to go ahead. It only works so much, because if she suddenly gets on the stand and forgets and loses her memory, you're going to lose, or won't show up, and you have to do a bench warrant for the victim. This fellow wrote an article about it in a publication for courts. He said they had a residence where the police had been there that year 15 times. So when they put this program into place, they arrested the guy, they took him in, and they put conditions on him, and they never had to go back there again. So he moved out of the county. He said he's not going to stay in a county where you can't beat your wife. But so it worked with him. But I don't know if that program maintained itself. But I know that they did have a significant drop in domestic violence complaints when that program was in effect.
Can you define what a domestic assault restraining order is?
Usually it simply restricts assault, obviously, and it can have you can't go within 500 yards. You can't hang around outside the house. You can't stalk. We didn't have the stalking laws back then either, and so now some of those things would be stalking and be criminal in their own right without the domestic relationship. But the domestic assault restraining order would put protections on so that the victim that asked for it would have this person kept away from them. Can't show up at their workplace and that kind of thing. All the little things people do to harass can be included in that domestic assault restraining order, just like the personal protection order would have conditions on it.
Like threats, intimidation. Yeah.
Right. Every night you come out from work, and there they are sitting in the car across the street watching you. Now, they didn't touch you, but they can prohibit that kind of thing. And, of course, the other parts of it were the 48-hour arraignment, 72 hours for a hearing. The one thing that I didn't like when they changed things is there was a requirement initially for a hearing to be set when you issued that temporary restraining order or the ex parte order. And they removed the necessity of that, and they changed it to the defendant had 14 days to demand a hearing and have it set. So they put the burden of getting a hearing on the defendant. I had a guy call me one time, and his girlfriend had gotten a PPO, personal protection order, and he said, well, Judge, I want to know whether I have to come. He said, all that stuff she said I didn't do any of that. And it says the order says I can't do that. Well, I wasn't doing it in the first place, so do I need to even come? Because I'm not going to do it. I said, are you telling me she's lying? He says, yeah, I didn't do any of those things. I said, you better come. So I get to the hearing, and the woman's on the stand, and I said, did he do this and this and this? No. I said, well, why did you falsely swore? She said, well, I went to the Domestic Assault Coalition. There was an office they established, and they helped people fill these PPOs out. Well, what they told her was, did he do any of these things? Well, no. Well, if you don't have any of these things, you won't get one. Oh, okay. I'll go in and say he did these things.
What's the burden of proof for filing like a restraining order? What kind of proof do you need as a judge to issue one?
Well, they're done under oath, so you have sworn statements of certain facts, and the facts have to be that there is a danger. If you're going to do it ex parte, irreparable harm, like I had one guy come in with his lawyer, and she wanted, no, the woman, she wanted an ex parte order, and the defendant was in jail in another county for 90 days. Well, I'm not going to do an ex parte order. He's not going to assault her for 90 days. So you have to have what they call exigent circumstances. In other words, that there is a good chance that if I don't have this restriction, if this person isn't restricted from doing this, there's going to be something bad that's going to happen, and it isn't going to be just money damage. Somebody's going to get hurt. The problem with PPOs is there's no venue requirement, meaning I can be from Marquette, Michigan, and I can get one in Kalamazoo. And what people do is they shop. And there are judges who actually do their job. And they look at that and say, are these facts sufficient? And sometimes you're seeing fishy little ambiguities in there. The court rule says you can go interview the applicant. And I did that a couple of times because I found out those ambiguities were intentional and the real facts didn't support it. They were just an inference that maybe they did. I wanted to be confident that it was a need for it. What really bothered me about PPOs is PPOs are ex parte orders. We call them TROs in other civil cases, temporary restraining orders, where the other side hasn't been heard. And those require you to have made an effort to resolve the problem with the other side without getting the order. And you have to say, I tried. Well, the PPOs don't require that. And judges tend to forget the exigent circumstance. It's extraordinary to issue an order against someone when they don't have a chance to respond yet. They restrain you from things. Once you're served, you can't possess a firearm.
Is that like the red flag law?
It doesn't go as far as red flag because you have to have more proof for that. Every domestic assault, in my mind, doesn't necessitate having to have someone prohibited from having a firearm because there's all different degrees of things. When you sign those orders, and once a person comes in on a domestic violence complaint criminally, there will be conditions and they will restrict them from contact. And there were all sorts of other things. Personal protection orders expanded outside divorces and expanded into members of the same household. There's two kinds. There's a stalking section and there's a domestic section. And the domestic section requires only one incident to get it issued, whereas stalking has to be stalking.
What I'm hearing from you, though, is wanting to be measured. And isn't that what we want judges to be, is to slow things down and be deliberate and measured in how they're taking in information? We do. Everyone else is so emotional and high stakes in the room. It's good to hear a judge say, like, I want to be deliberate about the information I'm getting. Seems like a low bar, but I don't know. That just struck me.
And unfortunately, as judges, like with any profession, some of them do and some of them don't. Like I said, some of them rubber stamp. Some of them just have little pigeonholes. If it's this, I do it, I'll issue it. And if it's not, I won't. Without really looking at the whole thing. And police agencies, when you don't have a domestic situation, and let's say your neighbors are fighting, and then the police officers are prone to come in and say, well, I can't do anything about that. Get a PPO. Well, they're neighbors, they're not domestic, so they have to have stalking. Well, the police officer knows these neighbors that don't get along don't fit stalking. So they're going to come in and try to get a PPO, and they're going to be denied, and they're going to be mad at the judge. And I've lectured police officers and say, if you're in a stalking situation and you think they can get a PPO, you could arrest them for stalking. But you just want to get
Right.
your plate. So you send them in to see the court, and then the court's going to make them mad if they're doing their job. And I think what I would do if I could reform the system is I would create a place to refer these people to say, you people have a problem. You need to get together with some neutral party to see if you can resolve it. And many times they can. And, people get angry with each other. What I learned in doing small claims is they'll get mad and one of them will come and sue the other, and they'll come to court. And when I ask them what they want, they're in agreement. And I said, well, haven't you talked to each other? Well, no, I came straight to court. So if you can make people sit down and talk.
Common sense.
Yeah.
Common sense, but you see, when they were angry with each other and they hired a gladiator for each of them, it got lost in the common sense part.
This is a good segue too, because you worked as a mediator as well.
Yes. That was after I retired. I used some of the same tools that I did from the bench if I was going to have a non-jury trial. I would say...
Yeah, there must be overlap. Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me of we had a little deputy sheriff around here. If you saw him, you'd think he looked like Barney Fife. You got to remember there's a generational thing there. Don Knotts. He looks like a skinny old police officer who was kind of a joke, but he was very clever. And he'd get an interrogation with someone and he'd say, well, John, well, son. He'd always say, well, son, tuck up his gun belt. You want to tell your story, or do you want someone else to tell it for you? And he'd start out that way. And so when I had one of these non-jury trials, I would say to the parties, before we start, I'm going to hear both your stories, and I'm not going to understand them as well as you do. And I'm going to enter a result, which might make one of you happy and one sad, or both of you sad. You might want to write your own story. You might want to sit down and make sure that you don't leave it up to me. I'll do the best I can. But guarantee you, I won't see it through either of your eyes. So I'll give you 15 minutes. If you say, do your job, judge, come on back in, we'll have a trial. Almost every time they come in after 15 or 20 minutes and say, could we have a little more time? And maybe 70% of the time they'd settle. I try to get people to see the benefit in trying to resolve things without leaving it up to the court. And it'll work a lot of the time, unless people, like we talked about earlier, who one party doesn't want to settle anyway. They just want the fight. And that, unfortunately, I see that a lot.
When does mediation work? What's the correct scenario for mediation?
First, defining what it is you want and seeing what is really at issue with people. And sometimes it isn't what it looks like. And when you get right down to, the neighbor with the fence the wrong way, you find what they can agree on and get them as close as possible. And then you do a risk-benefit analysis. I know it's the principle of the thing, but, your benefit here is if you win everything you want, you're going to have a $10,000 judgment. Second question, is the other side collectible? And if they aren't, then you just got a $10,000 judgment. It's going to cost you $50,000 to litigate it. So you still want to go to trial, or would you like to settle for $4,000?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking what you're saying about sometimes one party is just not interested in a solution. And that happens a lot in couples therapy too, where, you have to figure out pretty quickly, are both parties willing to make adjustments and compromise and not get everything they want? Or is someone already 1 foot out the door or 2 feet out the door? And particularly when they've already crossed the line to feeling contempt for the other person, it's almost impossible at that point to salvage the relationship.
I could see that. A fellow told me the other day, he'd gotten a divorce, and he said, the problem is we didn't respect each other. Yeah, I didn't like domestic relations. Wasn't my favorite part of the docket. I did it for 8 years, and I was happy to let this other judge take all the domestic cases because the only thing I enjoyed were the kids. And you can take the kids into chambers when the law says if they're old enough to express an opinion, you give them an opportunity to express their preference when it comes to custody. Now, I didn't like that from this standpoint. What kind of pressure is that to put on a kid to make that decision?
Yeah.
And even when they have a preference, I think it's terrible. But the law says I go in and do that. So what I used to do is I go in chambers and I say, now, first, the rule is we don't have to tell anybody what we do in here. When I go out, I'm going to say, I gave you a chance to express a preference, period. I'm not going to say what you said. I said, the second rule is if you don't want to talk about a preference and you don't want to make that decision, nobody's going to know, but you and I will sit and talk about school. And most of the kids go, oh, yeah, that sounds good to me.
I can relate. Well, just in terms of not liking the situation as a therapist, it's dreadful when you are caught in between child custody and people are like subpoenaing you for your records and every little word you said about one parent or the other. And you just have to be so careful about what you're putting out there.
Yeah.
They will use it against you.
I've had those subpoenas a couple of times. One of the laws that we passed, and I've come to the conclusion that when a law is named after somebody, is generally not a good thing. And Michigan passed a statute, criminal statute, that said if there's sexual penetration and the victim's under 13 and the perpetrator's 17 or older, the penalty is a mandatory 25 years in the state penitentiary. There's two things I saw wrong with that. One is I had a number of cases where there were allegations made about molestation by the wife, and they were fabricated to get leverage against the husband. One of them, the woman later admitted that she fabricated it and got prosecuted and convicted for that. And then I had another case where a 9-year-old was on the stand when I was a district judge and told a story that just didn't smell right, and her testimony was kind of shaky. And then the defendant insisted on testifying, which lawyers always say don't. Don't do it at the preliminary examination because they can use that to cross-examine you at a trial. And the guy said, no, this didn't happen. And I want to tell the judge. So he gets on the stand, and the guy was so convincing that I wouldn't bind the case over to circuit. I dumped it. 5 years later, the daughter came to him and told him she was sorry that mom had set that whole thing up. Now you take that situation and you put a law in that says if you can't get that resolved and it goes to trial and you gamble that they won't believe you and they believe that child, you got 25 years mandatory sentence looking at you. Does that ever give that prosecuting attorney power for plea bargaining? I'll tell you what, plead to a 15-year and I'll recommend local time. Take away the risk of 25. You do a year in the county. That's what I hate about it. The other thing I hate about it is the very first case I had was a 17-year-old naive kid with no father figure, with a mother who had mental issues. She was a hoarder. And a 12-year-old streetwise girl offered him oral sex. Well, he's 17, he's immature, sounded good to him. And as he told me when he pled, I thought it was legal. I thought she was 14. I said, no, John, that would only be a 15-year felony. So here he is.
Wow.
And he confessed because he didn't think it was a big deal. And if the prosecutor had wanted to and said, I got a slam dunk case, 25 years on a 17-year-old. And to me, mandatory sentencing is always a bad idea. And that case really troubled me because that kid wasn't ready to grow up. He didn't even get it when I put him on probation on the 15-year with an opportunity not to have a conviction and go on the registry. He'll go on the registry for the rest of his life. I don't even want to start up talk about the registry because that's one of my crusades. But he never made it through probation. I had to revoke him after his third violation, and they were stupid things. He went and got drunk and resisted a police officer, and we finally got him straightened around. But what he ended up with is a 15-year sex offense on his record and a registration that he'll live with the rest of his life.
As a judge, I imagine you believe in, rehabilitation and compassion. And like you're saying, there are some laws in sentencing that pretty much give you zero chance to recover from that one act. If someone has to live with that for the rest of their life or have their voting stripped for the rest of their life or all the other examples, it's, at that point, what are we expecting of that person as a citizen or as a person to rise up to if there's a ceiling so low for them now? That how do they thrive then? Or how do we have even a chance of them being rehabilitated?
How do they rebound from that? Exactly.
Yes. Thank you. Well, speaking of which, you're still advocating to this day and working. That's over 50 years in the profession. I have to imagine you've seen a lot of changes in the different decades as society has changed.
I want to circle back on, I know we touched on mediation a little bit, but Bill, what do you wish, having dealt with divorcing couples or couples going through mediation, what do you wish they knew about that process and how they could leverage that tool a little bit better?
Well, they could use it the way they claim they use it and not abandon the process. And there was a provision for a certain amount of the filing fees to go into a fund to pay for counseling for people thinking about divorce. But there were monies available for people who couldn't afford counseling.
Okay.
They were trying to work out problems, and it was good however it came out. They either worked the problems out or they decided they couldn't, and at least they were more civil going into the litigation. My daughter, she was having an issue with her 14-year-old son who was so angry with his father, he wouldn't go with him. And the father was saying, I want you held in contempt because you're not making him go. The case had gotten moved out of this county because of me. And I looked in their book, and every friend of the court's office has to have a booklet. And it said mediation services. I said, they need to sit down and work this out. So I called down there. Oh, we don't do that anymore. You're going to have to file a petition to modify parenting time. I said, well, why is it in your handbook? Yeah, we should change that. You want to know what I'd like to see changed? People having mediation and using mediation, we ended up having to file that petition, and we worked it out. When we were brought together, we worked it out. Ended up with the kid going into counseling and the father with him and trying to work some of those issues out. It wasn't necessary to make it adversarial, but the system forced us to make it adversarial.
And collateral damage. I mean, you think of couples who are getting toxic in their divorce, who are really emotionally damaging their children through the process of all of that toxicity.
Absolutely.
Michelle, you'd probably agree with this. They should mandate counseling for couples who are going through mediation or divorce. Or maybe they do. Do they?
I don't think so.
But at the very least, they should mandate co-parenting classes, high conflict resolution, co-parenting, all of that, because they may never get the couple to want to work together, but for the sake of the children, especially if they're split households where the children have to go back and forth, the parents have to get on the same page about some of that.
Yeah.
Bill, when you watch a TV show and there's a judge, do you judge the judge? Do you
Are you like that would never happen?
Yes. Sometimes I don't like to watch those shows because I see things that doesn't happen, and I see people do things that give an image to judges that is false. If we treated people that rudely, we wouldn't be on the bench too long. There was a show that was pretty close called Judging Amy. I don't know if you ever watched it.
Oh yeah, I used to watch that.
Yeah, she was a juvenile court judge. In one of her shows, a judge in a criminal division sent the bailiff down and yanked a lawyer right out of her hearing. And there she was in the middle of a hearing. We had a judge that did that in our county that walked into my courtroom one time and yelled at a lawyer who would come in late. And we both had the same docket at the same time, so there were sometimes conflicts, and interrupted one of my arraignments and yelled at this guy, "You get into my courtroom."
These stories you're telling, like you've seen so much and you've written articles and you've been a part of the system for so long. Like you're an expert in human behavior, I would say at this point, because you've been in the system, which is very different from looking at it from the outside.
Yeah, I've seen it. I said, I don't mind sharing. The public paid me all those years, and a lot of that education came while I was on the public dime. So that's why I wrote the columns, because I felt I should share.
Oh yeah, well we appreciate.
Well, it's also it would be helpful for there to be a little bit more civic learning around the justice system, and not just assumptions made or extreme views. So
Yeah.
every little piece of insight helps us understand.
Yeah.
That was my motivating factor, is to have people understand what judges deal with. And when we sentence people and people don't like the sentence, they don't realize we've got 25 pages of a report that tells us a lot of things we can't really publicly talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes a victim of a crime was a 50% contributor, but I don't go out there and say that when I sentence a defendant. I'm not going to badmouth the victim. So you have that information, and then people look at the sentence and say, well, why didn't you send that person to prison? But you can't really defend yourself in a lot of instances.
Bill Buhl was a prosecutor. He was a district court judge and a circuit court judge. You've certainly enlightened us here today, Bill. So thank you so much for your time and your public service.
Glad to do it.
He's great. I mean,
yeah, what a neat story.
And I just, how like there's some things in life you've just never done, but it doesn't occur to you've never done them. I've never met a judge in real life.
Neither have I, and that's why I selfishly wanted to ask him all these other questions about being a judge. But I think obviously we want to talk about his background as it relates to like couples or relationships or just dealing with divorce or mediation. So that I think that was kind of the goal, but we could probably talk for hours about him, in his cases and being a judge. Like that's such a huge responsibility. And when he talked about bringing the kids in to his chambers and talking about like what they wanted when it came to custody, I thought that was really, really compelling too.
Just his compassion in that situation, to realize the impact it could have on a kid, to have to say out loud like what they prefer or not have an answer. The way he said he handled it with the children, it was really lovely.
I don't know the numbers, but people don't necessarily have to go to court. They don't have to deal with a judge. I've never dealt with a judge. When I got divorced, we used mediation, dealing with a mediator who was a lawyer who simply just worked with both of us and came up with a solution. And like Bill says, it's a lot cheaper than dealing with going to court.
Yeah, and it kind of cuts out so much of the clutter and the noise. One of the big themes we talked about throughout with him is the idea of like just direct and honest communication between two people, and how that will more likely lead to a positive outcome than like all the other factors come in. But mediation and, slowing down and all the things he talked about are ways to just get two humans in a room to say what they need to say and go from there.
Yeah, he put a great spin on that part.
Well, I was just thinking like, and this is making me percolate a little bit about what the deep dive would be, because like what I kept coming back to is like all these systems we have, at least in our country, in the United States, that are broken in ways that there are actual solutions, and he alluded to that a little bit with certain programs different counties tried to enact. But when you talk about mediation and just having something funded where average people would have access to mediation, access to couple therapy, access to, free co-parenting classes. Those are all, not having that is such a barrier to good outcomes. And maybe that's just me getting frustrated, is like, we know certain things do actually work, and it would be so great if we could, direct focus and funding towards those things.
Well, yeah, it was cool. It was just cool having a judge on our podcast. I mean, just having that kind of insight was amazing. And I don't know if I've ever, or maybe we'll ever have that kind of exposure to the legal system from that inside point of view.
Exactly. It was a peek behind the curtain of a system that I, for certain, don't know a lot about. And so it's just fascinating.
How does that influence you from your practice point of view, like hearing his perspective? What you do as a professional could very well impact the legal system.
I guess when I said I have never met a judge, I meant like personally, that I could just have a chat with, but I have been in a courtroom and professionally, and it's incredibly intimidating. And, when you are, writing your notes about sessions, or you're trying to support someone with their mental health, you're thinking in terms of their treatment and their goals in life, and supporting them through that. And it's can be difficult when out of the blue, there's some legal issue, and you have to go back and read your own notes and say, like, did I put something in here that I'm going to be scared someone else to see? Like, especially like I was saying with child custody issues, obviously the person I'm treating is going to say things about their partner. I never put that stuff in notes, because it's like, what's the bare minimum I can say about content while focusing more on intervention as a therapist. But I'm getting into the weeds. I guess what I would say is what comes up the most for me is not in my private practice, but in my other work in nonprofit, working with survivors of domestic violence and perpetrators of domestic violence. We can get very down on the system, because a lot of times we're seeing for ourselves, police departments that aren't, following through on risky situations. We're seeing judges who aren't, maybe stepping up when there's real safety concerns, or we do need restraining orders, or trying to help, a family stabilize when they are being harassed. And so it can be difficult to feel hopeful when we see so many barriers in the system working against our domestic violence survivors. But at the same time, like, there's a lot of great programs in California in particular. There's a program called Victims of Crime. And it has so many insanely good resources for exactly that, victims of crime, whether that's a child who, has experienced abuse, or a survivor of domestic violence. They have so many resources. So I would recommend for anyone listening that is going through something like that to check out in their own state, whether they have a similar program. Certainly, if you're in California, Google Victims of Crime program. Because there's help out there that people are not even aware.
Speaking of domestic violence, if you or someone you know is the victim of domestic violence, there is help out there. You can call their number 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-SAFE. You can also text them START to 88788. We would encourage any of our listeners or people out there to reach out if you are the victim of domestic violence.
If you're struggling with family, friends, or coworkers, in a bad relationship and wondering what to do, or you want a relationship and to set yourself up for success, then we want to talk to you. So make your appointment on Unrelating. To be a guest, ask a question, or recommend a topic, drop us an email at theunrelatingpodcast@gmail.com. And be sure to follow us on Instagram or Facebook.